let's do this.
Yeah, let's get into it. Gabe and I are honored and excited to have Sarah Ballini-Ross with us today. As you may or may not know, I was going to say Sarah and I are doing a podcast, but really Sarah's doing the podcast. I'm the supporting technical cast.
You're just friend of Sarah at this
Yeah,
point.
yeah, and it's Hard Hats and Heart, and it's talking about human-centered innovation. And so obviously for Gabe and I doing Safeonomics this year, kind of focusing on the individual and what you can do to improve yourself as an individual and as a professional. We thought this would be a great discussion on Safeonomics, and also again, we talk about how people are our greatest asset, and I think human-centered innovation is a way to demonstrate that to your people. So without rambling on too much longer, maybe we'll jump into the discussion.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, Sarah, this is one of the things that really fascinated me about your podcast and your approach to innovation is that I Scott and I both, through Safeonomics and then even in our own individual careers, have approached business from the perspective of really like, okay, so there are tasks that need to be done. There are financials that need to be evaluated, and then metrics that need to be managed too. And so it's very much data and productivity and task driven. And so when you started talking about the human element of innovation and of design, that sparked for me that concept that Scott had mentioned of a lot of business leaders will say, well, people are our greatest asset. But I don't think anybody really has a good definition of what that means, me included, as to what that looks like. Because on any given day, today included, that I could find that people could be my greatest asset, but then it's just like, oh my gosh, like they're a huge liability, and business would be so much easier if I didn't have employees. Um, so how does that translate for you? That's what I want to look at in this discussion is how do business and human beings come together? And how do we actually define how people can be our greatest asset?
Yeah, I think we have to think about without our employees, we have no businesses. So it's really critical that we invest in those people and that keeping them in the forefront of it. Some of
Right.
the ways that we can make our best assets is really making sure that they're well trained to do their jobs, that they're supported, that you have a mentoring program. So when things get tough or change happens, they have somebody to go to in the organization that they can really believe in and trust their guidance for.
Hmm.
Thinking about, are we offering our employees professional development? Are we just expecting them to do the same thing over and over again? Are we helping to grow our employees to be the person that we want to be? So maybe we don't want to strangle them, and that we're helping give them the guidance that they need to really thrive. And
Hmm.
then I think about the diversity aspect, right? We can't have a business with all the same ideas and mindsets, and that diversity really brings us that richness that helps us keep people first. But then also, we need to be accommodating with that. We need to think about flexible work arrangements, how people are doing, and ways that we can support people in their whole selves.
Yeah, I think that's super important too, where it's just I mean, I've even run into this too, where I have to stop and think sometimes where if someone is not performing or multiple people are not performing to the level that I'm expecting them to, it's not necessarily like, well, the people are the problem or the employees are the problem. I have to stop and think, okay, have I given them adequate training?
Yeah.
Do they have the resources they need to actually do this? Are they even it's like, do they have the right PPE to help them to actually do this job, and can it be done better? It feels like that's something that a business leader should be looking at instead of immediately looking at the worker and saying, well, the worker is the problem and suck it up, buttercup, and you can do better. I mean, what have you seen as far as how business leaders, how executive management can come into that situation and start to ask those kind of questions where it's like, okay, well, is the human being the problem? Is the work the problem? Or is there a bigger issue that needs to be addressed?
I think that's where it really comes down to communication and management styles, right? If something's not working, do you have the type of relationship and the rapport that you can really just be frank with the employee and try to get to the root cause of it? Or is it a pretty toxic environment where you're just going to assume that it's the employee who's doing something wrong and you're either going to reprimand and kind of perpetuate that toxic cycle? I've seen learning teams be really helpful in these
Mm,
situations where you bring together a diverse set of employees and just keep asking the why. What's going on? Why is it like this? Why do you do it this way? And really to start to understand why they are doing it. Oftentimes, the employees, they've been doing those jobs for a long time and they have a lot of pride, but they also have some ideas that aren't always listened to. So, trying to
mm.
create that opportunity for dialogue to allow innovation and that curiosity to really spark and happen, that's when you can really solve some problems in unique ways that maybe management and leadership wouldn't always think of.
Mm.
Yeah, maybe before we get uh, any further into the conversation, we could stop. And I mentioned that, Sarah's podcast, and I think her passion is around human-centered innovation. Maybe we could just pause to explain exactly what that is, because it was a paradigm shift for me, I think, when Sarah, when you and I first started talking.
You read my mind.
Yeah.
I was going to be just like, well, can you define human-centered innovation, please?
Yeah. So I think about the typical innovation process you go through. You're defining your problem, you iterate, you come up with a solution. But with a human-centered approach, you're really putting the end users in the beginning. You're really looking at them as the experts and you're keeping them as the forefront in all of your decisions. And that really translate when you become a people first organization, right? Are we prioritizing those employees in all of our business decisions? Are we thinking about what's going to be best from them, from our design of our workplace to flexible work arrangements to the tasks that they're doing? And with human centered innovation, it's really keeping that end user at the forefront of all of those things and having them be a part of the process and not just having it happen to them, but have it happening with them.
Yeah, and I think that was the big shift for me too, because and it might be due to my experience level in the workforce, but implementing, I was involved in a lot of technology implementations, and we always talked about change management, and it always felt like it was more, you wanted to get people on board, but you're managing the change that they're going to have to go through with this new technology that you're introducing, versus the human-centered innovation felt more like, well, let's iterate around the humans and maybe figure out how to enhance their job roles, their functions, their process, versus introducing a new process
Mm.
or new technology.
I think that's where the role of empathy really comes in, which is one of the key elements of that human-centered innovation, is really understanding what's going on, what are the needs and desires, and keeping that in the forefront when you're implementing solutions. Change management's absolutely critical, especially when it comes to that final stages. When you've gone through the iterative designs and you have something that works, you do need that implementation and change management. But the human-centered design or human-centered innovation approach brings together that interdisciplinary collaboration earlier on than typical implementation. So you have that opportunity to get that user feedback before you're at that final stage. So hopefully you have a better implementation overall.
So that's one of the things that I liked about how you focused on human-centered innovation and not necessarily just technology. Because innovation could take all sorts of forms. It's not necessarily just a new software platform that's deployed or something like that. Sometimes it's just a new way of doing things.
Mhm.
And that's what I've seen more often than not, is that people are so set in the ways that they do things. And then let's say corporate has, they go to their executive retreat, they have this wonderful brainstorming idea, and they come back and they're just like, this is the best thing since sliced bread, and we're going to do this from now on. And then the workers who have been doing it for the same way for the last 10, 15, 20 years, they believe that the way that they're doing it is the best way, which is, it may be true, but then how do you bridge that gap? And so now we're not even talking about a software product that's being put into place. We're talking about just a different way of doing things. So it feels like the even the process of innovating requires more than just the C-suite meeting at their executive retreat and everybody else doing their thing and then it coming together. How do you see that, let's say in an ideal world, what does innovation actually look like when it's human-centered?
Think when it's human centered, it's not just the C suite making those decisions, right? You have that interdisciplinary collaboration where you have all lines of workers involved in those brainstorming ideas, who are generating the ideas, who are helping to define the problem, right? Because management may think it's one problem, but you go talk to people on the front lines and they will bring up a whole different idea of what the real problem is. And so it's getting all of those voices early on in the beginning, because once you already have a solution or idea in place and you go to people, it's really hard to gain their buy-in and trust when you said,
Mhm.
here's what we're going to be doing, guys. And that's where, people's natural resistance to change really peaks up in those situations. They take a lot of pride in their jobs, especially if they have a long tenure with it. And then
Right.
it's really, you have a lot of resistance to those changes, even if it is a good change.
You brought up something that was kinda interesting too, where it was like the dynamics of how people work together is so critical, and I had heard this acronym called HIPPO, where it's a highest paid
It's paid
person's opinion.
opinion.
Yeah, that's the one that wins. And so it's like, if you have someone, let's say the CEO comes to an all hands meeting and says, "This is the greatest thing. We talked about this when we were in the Bahamas, whatever, and this is what we're gonna do from now on." Everyone's gonna kinda nod their heads and be like, "Okay, well, it's the CEO. We're gonna go for it." And then you might have someone who has, let's say, 25 years of tenure who looks at it and immediately can say, "This is not a good idea. This is not gonna work." And so there, as you said, to circle back to your even earlier comment, having that environment where people can actually feel safe
Mhm.
in expressing their opinions is gonna be absolutely important because even for that CEO, they might be missing out on some really valuable input from someone that's in the front lines that can tell them, "Hey, this is why your idea is not gonna work," or "Here's how we can do it better."
And I think that's where the human-centered innovation of it, right? Because it's that integration of that user feedback that's really prioritized and that iteration. So the CEO does come up with a really good idea, but that
Mm,
20-year employee says, gosh, you really missed the ball in these areas. Well, they just gave you some great insight. So now that's your
right.
opportunity for that management team to go back, to iterate, to take that feedback, which shows the worker that they were respected, that their opinions were valued, that they were heard, and then go to them with a new solution and say, well, what do you think about this? We heard what you said. We made some changes. Do you think this would work better? But it takes that environment, that psychological safety where the ad employee really does feel comfortable to say, this is a terrible idea, guys. It's not going to
Mhm.
work versus, okay, I'll do it. And then go back to their job and keep going the way that they've always been doing it.
Yeah, I want to, and maybe everybody else is already up to speed and I'm just spelling it out, but that because Gabe talked about it isn't just about technology, right? This
Mhm.
human-centered innovation is really, I think, a way to demonstrate how people are your greatest asset because you're involving them in these discussions and this process and understanding their challenges and what opportunities they see as well. But it is, and we're kind of joking around the topic a little bit about HIPPO or whatnot. But sometimes, senior executives or senior management might want to hear from people, but there might, if it's the first time they're going out onto the floor to ask people's opinions or questions, there might be some reluctance to be, well, I don't want to talk bad about the boss's idea because she's just going to hold that against me. And next time I have a review, I'm not going to get that promotion or that raise. So how have you seen, Sarah, some of the senior leaders within organizations introduce the concept and win over the trust and confidence of employees?
It's a good question.
I think that's where frontline supervisors really play a really critical role because they do have the relationship with those employees. And so they can kind of be those tenants of that upper leadership to bring the ideas to their employees, to have those frank conversations. Because, yeah, when the hippo's in the room, people oftentimes are pretty quiet. I definitely called out a director. I called him a hippo, and he had never heard the term before. And so I'm no that you brought it up, Gabe, because I was totally yeah, very embarrassing moment calling somebody a hippo and they weren't familiar with the acronym and what that really
That's
meant.
awesome.
But it does play a really it does change the dynamic completely, right? Because you want to keep your job. You don't want to rock the boat. You don't want to ruffle the feathers. And so you may internalize what you think are great ideas because you don't want to be that disruptor.
Mm.
But that's kind of what innovation is. We celebrate those disruptors. We look for them. We kind of value that input. And sometimes it can't be a conversation. Maybe you need to be doing a survey or have other ways of being able to collect that feedback that gives people the time and space to be able to do it. Maybe it's an anonymous ideas where people don't have to feel attached to their ideas and they have an opportunity to contribute without it being pointed directly at them.
So I think that's super important too. You touched on something that was fascinating to me, where um, the idea of people expressing their opinions in different ways.
Mhm.
So let's say you have an all hands meeting, and then the CEO says something like, "Well, if anybody has any better ideas, let me know." Okay, maybe some of your best ideas are going to come from the people that are not comfortable with standing up in front of like even 10 people
Yeah.
and saying what they think. But if you have an avenue where people can express it in writing or they can pull you aside for a meeting, that kind of thing, understanding that different people have different ways of communicating and being able to build an avenue for them to express that. I think you're opening yourself up to even better ideas and more
Mhm.
ideas at that point. So what have you seen where maybe it was a real life case or maybe in your in an ideal world, how people are able to make those tiny steps. Let's say you have a situation where and I've been in this place where I've come to my team and said, "Okay, this is what we're gonna do. Anybody have any ideas?" Nobody says anything at that meeting, and I think, "Okay, everything's great." They leave, and then I found out after the fact that, oh my gosh, there were so many people that were not happy with how things were going, and I didn't hear about it, and I actually wanted to. And it was really frustrating for me as a leader to just be like, "Oh my gosh, I went down this path that I really didn't wanna go down." And if someone had said something, I would have changed it. So what are some steps that you would suggest for someone, let's say for leadership, for even middle management to take to start kind of turning that ship to build that culture where ideas can kind of bubble up and people can even give, you know, even dissenting
Mhm.
ideas or input? Like how does that work?
I think that's where you really have to start with the problem, right? So if we're having people engage and provide their input of what that problem that you're trying to solve is, it starts opening that door for that conversation or that feedback. Where if you already have a solution in place, you've already kind of skipped over a few steps, and it's really hard to get people to feel valued at that point. Where if you say, gosh, we reviewed our financials and we're really struggling in X, Y, and Z. We're trying to figure out why. What are your guys' thoughts of why this is happening? That opens that door for that dialogue to begin very early on, and it puts the process in place to have those conversations once you identify a solution. Now it's not a completely foreign concept. It's really great to be able to do that in person, but we know that's not always possible. And that's where technology makes it pretty
Mm,
easy. So once you do have your problem statement kind of identified, you've got that feedback, you have that interdisciplinary team who's helped you really define that well crafted problem statement, then that's where you can have a contest. You can make it fun. You can gamify it. You don't have to, make it be this is leadership's idea. It's, hey, what are your guys' thoughts of how we can tackle this? What are some ways that we can go about it? And really try to get that innovation mindset going within your organization. Try to spark that curiosity with your employees.
mm,
Really look to those trusted employees and, sit down and just have a 10-minute conversation with them. If you were in my shoes, how would you handle this? If you were the boss for the day, what would you do? And give them that opportunity to really shine in a safe, maybe it's not in front of the whole team. So you pull them aside and give them a coffee and you have that conversation. I've also seen idea logs work really well, where you have this problem statement, a quick little QR code, and then anybody can scan it and submit an idea of how they would solve it.
Hmm.
Or if they have an idea of like a solution in place, they can, drop those ideas in as well and then be able to manage that. And that's where the feedback comes in to be really important, so that the people, once they give their ideas, that they feel like they were heard, even if they weren't adopted. So being able to circle back and say, hey, we heard a lot of really great ideas. We explored a number of them, and, X, Y, and Z are some of the reasons why we can't pursue all of them. But this is what we've done. We've taken a number of these ideas, we've mixed them together, and we're really excited to try this. And that's that trying, right? It doesn't always work in all situations. You can't always have an iterative approach. If there's a regulation change, the feds don't really care if you're trying to
Yeah.
iterate and try to figure out how to
Right.
follow the rules. So there's a
Right.
time and place for iteration. But when possible, being able to iterate on those really helps keep that people first mindset when it comes to those solutions, and giving people the opportunities to really have a voice in the situation.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna I was gonna ask was it's one thing to solicit feedback or input, and then it's another thing to demonstrate that you're actually listening.
Mhm.
I think you touched on a few examples of how you could uh, demonstrate that you are listening, and I don't know if you can expand on that, or some examples that you've seen that work well, because I think it's like that flywheel. Like once you get momentum, then you start out day one with maybe getting one or two ideas, and then hopefully by the end of the year you're flooded with great ideas, because you've not only asked the question, but you've kind of reinforced that you're listening.
Yeah, I think that's where transparency is really key. So in the innovation world, there's even some innovation software that helps that, from idea generator to tracking where it is, whether it
Hmm.
was abandoned, adopted, if it's been kind of shelved for a later time, and being able to make that public, right? Or not necessarily public, but open to your organization so people can see, where is their idea? Has it been reviewed yet? Has it not been even looked at yet? Or did they look at it and decided it just doesn't really work within our current situation? Or maybe it needs to be tweaked or modified. And then that's where circling back at your leadership and management meetings, if you're having regular staff meetings, kind of recognizing those that submitted ideas, even if they weren't adopted, just giving them a quick shout out saying, hey, Gabe and Scott, thank you so much for sharing your ideas of how we could solve problem X. We really appreciated you taking the time to do so. Giving, random awards to people who are submitting those ideas, even if the ideas aren't what you're looking for, but just reinforcing that behavior, that there's no bad idea, that we're going to value any idea. And then if it is a really obscure one, having that conversation of like, why do you think this would work? What makes you think that this is the direction we need to go, to really understand where that user is coming from? Because most likely that person's going to be pretty resistant to the change if they're coming up with an off the wall solution, and then you're telling them they need to follow this new procedure to a T. So giving them the chance to kind of have their voice heard, and then better understand where they're coming from with that mindset.
That's so interesting. I remember there was a company that I worked at before where whenever we would do a brainstorming session, there was one guy that the first thing he would write was like the most random word. He'd write toaster or like elephant or something like that on the board. And I asked him eventually, I'm like, why are you doing this? Like, it's the dumbest thing. It's a waste of time. He said, no, my job is to go out there and throw out the most crazy word or suggestion on the board. And basically any idea after that is not
Good.
nearly as crazy as what I just threw out. So he opened the floor for innovation, for ideas in it. So I wanted to throw that out a little bit too, and not saying that I'm gonna, you know, generate the crazy, like let's build a rocket and that kind of thing. But this idea of innovating and coming up with ideas, is that something that can be taught? Or I mean, I know that some people are more open to doing it, and they're definitely idea people. Scott, you're one of those idea people for me. Like you have those that like you and I have conversations where it's just like, okay, let's throw something crazy on the wall and see if it sticks. But Sarah, what have you seen in your work that has helped people to grow in that innovation mindset?
Definitely, it's that encouraging curiosity. A lot of times, especially in like manufacturing and construction, we really want things done a certain way on a repeatable basis. We don't necessarily want that curiosity. We don't want that deviation. So it is really hard to kind of have that mindset shift. We also have to have a tolerance for failure because with a lot of innovation comes a lot of failure. And in a lot
Right.
of organizations, failure is a bad word. That is not part of the culture of organization. So teaching that failure is a huge part of that innovation process is really, really critical.
Mm.
That collaborative learning, giving people the time and space and production driven environments, it's hard to take a step back and get into an innovation mindset when you're worrying about what's going to happen on the production line and are we going to get these orders fulfilled and are we going to hit our deadlines. And that's where you have to be able to take some investment and right once again we're putting our people first, so we're able to kind of say it's okay guys, we're going to have a long lunch. We're going to stick around. We're going to be able to do this, and it's okay. And then there is some training really around design thinking that can help people understand that innovation process and kind of getting out of the normal mindsets that a lot of us kind of fall into.
Mm.
Having these what if scenarios. Well, what if this happened? What would you think? What if you had $1 million to make a change in the production line? What would you do? Kind of giving them those ideas to think futuristic and then being able to kind of backwards plan and think what it could. And that's where, right, just having those relationships once again are really key. If people feel like they are valued, it's going to be a little bit easier for them to write toaster on the wall compared if they're fearful for their job. So being
Right.
able to have those opportunities to really have a voice at the table in all decisions, right? So if
Mm.
you're never talking to your employees about the decision process and anything, and then all of a sudden you go to them and you say, hey, we need your help solving this, they're going to, what's going on? So really
Right.
trying to figure out what are those ways that you can kind of make that organizational in the long term.
Mm.
Yeah, have you, and not not to put you on the spot, but I'll put you on the spot.
That's what we do here.
Yeah, it's just some, some maybe, practical real world examples that you could share where, potentially they didn't have that human-centered innovation
Mm.
approach, but introduced it, and then surprisingly had a couple of really significant monumental ideas come forward that you wouldn't have otherwise seen. Have you anything come to mind?
Yeah, one of the companies I was working with, they got really interested in their safety culture. So they wanted to do a survey, and then through their survey, they realized they had some opportunities for improvement in their safety culture. Well, that organization really was broken into separate job sites. And so what they were able to really learn is overall they were doing pretty well, but there was a few hot spots that really needed some extra attention. And so they started having barbecues. They started having weekly lunches where some of that upper management would just go sit with the folks, talk to them about what was going on, and start building those relationships and that rapport before they tried to get into the nuts and bolts of how are we going to make these changes. Through those conversations, some natural ideas came about, and then they were able to run with them. I also saw another company do an innovation challenge where they did like this 2 week period and they welcomed any idea and they gave a certain amount of budget that they could do with those ideas. And then they actually implemented a few of them. And that was such a fun experience for the employees who won that contest to see their ideas really making a difference in the organization. And that really lit a fire in that organization where even after that challenge, there was this buzz going where people just couldn't stop generating ideas going on.
It's funny. I took a tour of NASA in at Kennedy Space Center several years ago, and I found out from one of the docents who had worked on the Apollo program that NASA has this whole thing that they call I can't remember what it was exactly, but it was something like side shows or side projects. And it was all of this technology that would get developed when people were making something for, let's say, a space shuttle or a satellite that was going to go up. And they could develop it as a side project. And it was shocking how many things that we have now that were side projects, something like Velcro or MRIs or Wi-Fi came about as side projects. That it was something that it was a problem they were trying to solve, and someone was just like, "Ah, I think I'll play with this a little bit." And what they had done was they had built this culture of innovation and ideas. And so many of the projects were complete bombs, and then some of them were just absolute hits. And they were not related to any sort of, it wasn't related to a moon landing, it wasn't related to a shuttle launch, but it was something that someone was curious about that they could do. And so you built this culture of innovation. And what I find is fascinating is that, and you mentioned this a little bit too, is that it doesn't have to be a startup. It doesn't have to be something like a Google or a SpaceX or, a Silicon Valley type of thing that's on the cutting edge. You could be a steel mill. You could be a shipping company or a crane repair, company that does these things. And you can still have an innovative culture where you go to the people who are the best at coming up with ideas and have them come up with bring these innovations to mind. So let's say for a company that is fairly entrenched, and I mean safety, and Scott, I know like you and I have been in the safety world for a little while here, and we've seen that safety is maybe about 10 to 15 years behind where general business is. So how do you take safety as an industry, or PPE as an industry, and you build that concept of innovation in that organization? How do you start to tap into those ideas from the people that are there? And then maybe even from even let's say even from like a frontline worker standpoint. If you have a good idea, how do you start to build it and bring it up to the point where it starts getting implemented?
Think one thing you hit on that's absolutely critical is the concept of play, right? You give kids a couple blocks, some tape, and some glue, they're going to do all sorts of crazy things. You give
Oh,
adults
totally.
the same things, they're just going to stare at it. So it's getting play back into our vocabulary. And that's where having time to be able to play with problems is really, really helpful to get into that innovation mindset. That curiosity is critical once again, right? So, really having people want to solve the problems and think about how they could. One of the organizations I was running a field study with, they were using exoskeletons and the design wasn't great. The part of the exos were ending up around people's knees, but one of those employees, he was curious. He wanted to know if he could make it work. So after work, he went to the fabric store. He got a whole bunch of different Velcro, fasteners, snaps, and he got out a sewing machine and started messing around and playing with it to see what could make a difference. A couple weeks later, he had a solution that worked really well for him. And it not only worked well for him, pretty soon all of his coworkers were saying, "Hey, will you make me a set too? I see that working for you and I really want one." Well, sure enough, it looks a lot like what now that vendor is using for their permanent solution. But he had that opportunity to play. He was curious and he had the means to be able to kind of have that innovation lab and be able to put those ideas into practice and then see if it worked. Where if, we had an environment where we said you can't bring in any outside things, you're only allowed to use what was issued to you, he would have never had that opportunity with that. And that's some of the challenges with safety, right? When it comes to PPE, there's not a lot of opportunities to play with fall protection. We can't just be deciding we want to change up our harness or our lifelines.
Right.
So that's where, right, making sure people know what are those guardrails for innovation? Where is the safe times that we can play? What is those opportunities where we can kind of innovate? And where are the things that we don't have that freedom to be able to make those changes in?
Mm.
And really having people have that solid understanding. But a lot of our safety problems we're still struggling to solve. So that's where that innovation mindset's absolutely critical. Like, how many organizations still struggle with slips, trips, and falls? A lot of
Right.
them, right? It's not a very fun thing to tackle as a safety professional, but it's still one of the leading causes of injuries. And so, how can you bring up those frontline employees who are aware of all of the things? And that's where, that human centered innovation approach gets that feedback early on. So you can start having ideas kind of generate from all different angles of the organization.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier, Sarah, and I think it's a good point, like especially within safety, it's a lot of compliance and regulation and you don't necessarily have a lot of space to experiment. So how do you balance that creativity, and the guardrails you talked about, but balancing that creativity that innovation and the compliance aspect are probably a bit of a challenge within the safety field. So do you take it outside of daily operations, or you just very carefully, experiment or iterate on the shop floor?
I think it kind of depends on the situation. So if you're struggling with compliance around hearing protection, right? Have some conversations. Is it because it's uncomfortable, the ones that we're buying? Are they not accessible? And that's where it can kind of give you some ideas of where you can innovate, whether it's finding a different type of solution, making your current solution more accessible. That's where that user feedback is really critical of helping you identify what are those areas that we can do, have some opportunities to innovate in. But that's also where starting small is really helpful, especially in a compliance or highly regulatory environment. Have that safe group that you can kind of test ideas with before you go buy 1,000 of anything to make sure it's actually going to work well in your situation.
Hmm. So the episode of your podcast that I listened to recently was when you had Bo Sitzman
Yeah.
on, and it was such a great episode, and I loved listening to it. And the part that I realized as I was listening to it, and our listeners should go back to your episode and check that out because it was fascinating. But what I came back to was I was like, oh my gosh, this guy has developed a solution to a problem that so many people that are laying tile could
Mhm.
could benefit from. And if this guy was in a larger organization, now it sounds like he was an independent person. He was kind of inventing this on the side, that kind of thing. If he was in a larger organization, I can think of some large PPE suppliers and manufacturers who would probably come up with something like this. But if he was in it, I was just thinking, oh my gosh, I think his idea would get lost.
Mhm.
You need someone that is willing to put their their passion on the line to develop this and to grow it and to make this thing a reality. And that's something that Scott and I have been focusing on with Safeonomics this year is that you find people that are in safety that are inspired and want to make things better for the profession in the industry. And I feel like there's this kind of push and pull that happens where you have some people that have great ideas like Bo that can go and they know, okay, I'm working with this. I know other people that are dealing with this issue and I have a solution to do it. And then you have some other people that are super large suppliers and manufacturers that say, okay, well, we don't want to take the risk on these big on these projects because we're trying to hit our numbers for the next quarter. And so there's this huge discrepancy between the inventors and the innovators and the ones who are essentially cutting the checks to make things work. So when you come to that situation, you look at these two different camps. Um, how do people, let's say like Bo, if you have a good idea, how do you continue to develop it without getting basically just frustrated or irritated or dejected with people not picking it up? And then if you're on the other end of the spectrum, if you're a large supplier or manufacturer, how do you open yourself up to innovation from unlikely sources so that you can actually develop something that is going to be solving a problem for people down the line? I know that's a huge question. We're not going to answer that in the next like couple minutes, but ultimately it's like we're trying to get innovation in such a way where okay, we're open to new ideas, but there is a business like we can actually make it a business case. What are some of the small steps that we can do? Let's say even as the small inventor or as the big manufacturer to start opening that up.
That's where I think Bo's passion and perseverance really showed through because it
Yeah,
is
I love that. It
extremely
was so good.
I mean, it's extremely challenging when you have a great idea and you know it's going to make a difference, but you don't have millions of dollars at your disposal. You didn't just generate $20 million through, a funding stream, that you're working tile jobs on the side to be able to pay for that next production run.
Right.
That's where that passion and perseverance has to really carry through. But that's where it could be magical if we can start marrying the two. The large organizations with the resources, having some means and support for these independent innovators who have a great idea but don't necessarily have patent attorneys, they don't know how to manage supply chains and how to industrialize a solution in a large scale. And that's where I think, Boeing's, I always get the name wrong, the dojo, where like that's kind of their innovation incubator. That's a great opportunity where they
Right.
have that ability for their employees and outsiders to also come in with good ideas and be able to see if it can do what it needs to do and if they can kind of make it work in the long run. You do see some innovation challenges happening out there. I think it really was popular in the coding world, right? We had all of these
Right.
coding. If you could hack it, you got an award. If you could solve
Yeah.
it, you got an
Coding boot
award.
camps, all that
Coding boot
stuff.
camps, all
Yeah,
Yep.
the
the
stuff.
hackathons,
Hackathons.
Yeah.
Yes, that's what it was. Yep.
Yeah. And so if we had that same idea as a safety supplier, right? So how do we solve these long-standing safety problems of people not
That's
wearing
good.
their gloves, not wearing eye protection? What is it? Is it a little magic magnet that forces your glasses up when you put on your helmet, or like what
Sure.
make it work that we wouldn't really think of, but being able to kind of monetize and reward people for that and giving them some support. Corporations don't love innovation. If you've been in the innovation space, like the corporate life cycle of an innovation department's pretty short-lived in most situations.
Yeah.
It's oftentimes a really popular idea for a hot moment, and then it goes by the wayside when things get tough or challenging. And that's where it gets really hard because they do have large resources, they have those capabilities, but they're also not necessarily an innovation mindset
Hmm.
company.
Right. I think,
I've had that comment before to me where people will say like, "Oh, we really value innovation," and I'm like, "Okay, so show me on your P&L how much you put on R&D."
Mhm.
And there's usually silence after that point. I'm like, "All right, you answered your question for me."
yeah, I was gonna just comment that I think, Sarah, you touched on it. We didn't, I don't think, spend much time discussing it today, but that stakeholders are can be an important part of that innovation process. They're typically people too, and yeah, so it can be your supply chain or other strategic business partners, stakeholders that they can you can embrace in that human-centered innovation kind of idea. So if you had anything to share on that.
I think that's where your organizational stakeholders are really key. IT, legal, compliance, R&D, if you're lucky enough to have an R&D team in your organization. Those are the people that you want at your table to be your best friends because, right, if you're trying to do a solution that touches your network and your IT people aren't on board in the beginning, they're going to come at you with 9 million reasons why you can't do this compared to if you
Absolutely.
Yeah.
and so once again, like, right, what are those guardrails that you can do with those stakeholders? And then really understanding what are the stakeholders' values? What is it that they care about? Is it that they want to make sure that it's efficient, that it's not going to impact operations, that it's not going to get them sued? What are those things that really matter to the stakeholders? Get those documented in your problem statement so you really understand that piece of it. But that's that interdisciplinary team is really making sure your stakeholders are at the table for all stages, not just until you have a solution in place at the end.
Right.
Hmm.
So as we're sort of getting to the end of our discussion today, I found obviously maybe it goes without saying that when we first met and started talking, I was so excited about this opportunity to share your message with our audience that that we launched the Hard Hats and Heart podcast in partnership with you. So what if safety professionals sitting out there listening and saying, I want to be Sarah when I grow up? What
I
advice?
want to be Sarah when I grow up.
Yeah, what advice, suggestions do you have
Gosh.
for maybe moving out of a traditional compliance-based sort of safety role into more of an innovator or at least a catalyst or facilitator within your organization?
Be willing to accept failure, right? There's a quote that I use in a lot of my presentations is I haven't failed, I've just learned 20,000 different ways that it doesn't work. And that's something I embrace, right? Uh, I've ran a lot of pilots, and oftentimes the pilots were failures, but I walked away with so much more knowledge and understanding of what were those implementation challenges? How can we overcome those barriers in the next one? Really learning from those hard lessons has been a huge part of my success. But then also, I have to give some credit to my public health education of really thinking about things as a system, of thinking about how all the different layers really impacts a human's behavior and how the environment either supports or doesn't support the behavior, the intended behaviors. So I think, right, if you want to grow up to be me, first of all, you're crazy. My life is very challenging. I don't full-time job, but also the farm, it's a great opportunity for curiosity and problem solving. When you have a million different animals and a whole bunch of infrastructure issues and not a lot of resources and time, you get pretty creative with solutions. And that's, I think, carried over into my professional world. 10 years ago, I would have never guessed I'd be trimming sheep hooves in an exoskeleton or running around the farm in an augmented reality headset trying to keep up with folks, but that's kind of the world I live in now.
So that's something I wanted to like. I'm glad you brought it up because when I was doing my research before the interview, I was just like, oh my gosh, you're in a farm. And what I found is that people that are in an innovative sort of role, they have influences from outside of what their work is in order to actually build their ideas. So, for instance, like, I mean, my background's in finance, and I mean, I run a safety distribution, a PPE distribution company right now, and so it's all safety, safety, safety. It's PPE all the time, that kind of thing. But my wife does ceramics, and she's an art educator. And I find so much value in talking with her about what she's creating, how she teaches other people, and those kind of things. And it brings so many ideas for me for things that I can build into my company. And some things that it's like I didn't think it was possible to integrate how you create something like create a mug or a bowl or something like that from clay, but it actually builds innovation. So I feel like that's one of those things where I would encourage even our audience to do just in the same way that you've done, where you can take an experience that is outside of what is your quote unquote normal work, and you can actually incorporate it to build ideas and innovate on that. So yes, a farm, it is so far outside of safety innovation, but it actually you can learn some lessons out of it and you can bring that in. And I feel like that's what the safety profession needs. And there's so many ways where it can be grown, you can develop things out of it. Ideas can spring forth out of those kind of experiences. I feel like that's what safety professionals need to bring into the mix, is that they can bring experiences from outside of just whatever their work is and see how it attaches to their work, and then how do you innovate from there.
That's a great point. And that's where diversity is really critical, right? If we surround ourselves with people who are doing different things, have different backgrounds, have different experiences, it opens the door to be able to observe kind of like what you've done with your wife, of really learn from her world, but apply it into a safety lens. And I do the exact same thing. My husband's a native plant farmer, so he's constantly innovating, trying to figure out how to grow these impossible plants to grow. Sometimes he's using a dust buster to harvest seeds on a 100-degree day on his hands and knees, but they realize that's the only way to be able to get the seeds to be viable. But kind of learning from his iterations, his process of, he fails a lot. They have a lot of dead plants in order to get those few viable plugs. But then once they figure it out, they write a manual and then they're looked to by everybody across the world of how to do these really hard things. And I think
That's
that's
so
where that
cool.
perseverance really comes in, right? don't accept that initial failure and just throw your hands up and walk away. Keep going, keep trying to solve those problems, and keep talking to people, right? So that's where a lot of times we want to be really private with what we're trying because we want to have it be perfect. We have to let go of that perfection bias and be willing, if it's okay. So, what's that minimal viable product that we can kind of try, that we can iterate on and be able to go forth with? So, thank you so much for having me on Safeonomics. It has been an absolute pleasure, and it's such a joy to be able to talk with both of you, Gabe and Scott.
Man, I want to go and like try new stuff right now.
Yeah.
Let's do
Just for the
it.
heck of it.
Yeah. I I think in closing as well, that a lot of times innovation comes from people who aren't the expert because they come in with a different perspective and they're not necessarily entrenched in the tradition and maybe the way people are trained or educated on something. So be daring, take some risks, like Sarah said, don't be afraid to fail, and don't be afraid to have suggestions for areas outside of maybe your normal day-to-day expertise, and ask lots of questions.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So good.
Well,
Thank you,
yeah.
Sarah.
Yeah, thank
This
No
is
you.
great.
problem.
Our
All right.
pleasure to host you today, and we'll have your coordinates in the description below, so people can connect with you on LinkedIn or shoot you an email, learn more about what you do, how you can help their organization, or maybe provide a little bit of advice as to how they can get more into human-centered innovation as a profession.
Yeah, and definitely check out Hard Hats and Heart. I've enjoyed listening to it as well. It's on my podcast queue for sure.
Aw,
So
thank you so much.
looking forward to the next new episodes. I'm super excited. Like it's a lot of fun.
Well, good. It's been a blast having that podcast, and it's been an absolute joy to be on your podcast today. So, thank you again for this opportunity.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.